What if the reason you feel stuck right now is not because you're failing, but because you've been running your life on a system that was never designed for your peace? Pause for a second and really think about that. Because deep down, you already know something feels off. Not in a dramatic way, not in a loud collapse, but in a quiet, constant heaviness that follows you everywhere. You wake up and your mind is already full. You go through your day and nothing feels fully present. Even when you rest, you don't feel restored. And the strange part is, you can't even explain what's wrong, because on the outside, everything might look fine. That's what makes it so dangerous. When pain is obvious, you react. But when emptiness is subtle, you adapt to it. You normalize it. You start believing this is just how life feels for everyone. A cycle of pressure, distraction, exhaustion, and repetition. But it's not supposed to feel like this. Not at this intensity, not this often. There is a point where the human mind stops expanding and starts surviving. And survival mode is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It slowly narrows your focus until all you can see is what you must do next. Not what you want, not what you dream, just what is urgent, just what is expected. And over time, you stop noticing the difference between living and reacting. You tell yourself you are busy, but busyness is not the problem. The real problem is disconnection. You are doing more, but feeling less. Achieving more, but becoming less present in your own life. And the mind, when deprived of meaning, starts to drift. It looks for stimulation everywhere, but finds satisfaction nowhere. That's why even your rest doesn't feel like rest anymore. Because rest without mental clarity is just a pause in exhaustion, not recovery. You are not recharging, you are just delaying burnout. But here is what most people never realize. This state is not permanent. It feels permanent only because you are inside it. The mind adapts to noise so well that silence starts to feel unfamiliar. And because silence feels unfamiliar, you avoid it. You fill every empty space with something, anything, to keep from hearing your own thoughts too clearly. But the truth is, your thoughts are not the enemy. The chaos is. And somewhere underneath all of this mental noise, there is still a part of you that remembers how clarity feels. It remembers what it was like to wake up with direction instead of pressure, to think without spiraling, to move without dragging emotional weight behind every decision. That version of you is not gone. It is just buried under too much input, too many expectations, too many unfinished emotional cycles. And here is the uncomfortable truth most people avoid facing. You cannot think your way out of overload while staying in the same overload that created it. More effort inside a broken system does not create clarity. It creates exhaustion with better excuses. That is why at some point everything starts to feel like resistance. Even simple tasks feel heavier than they should. Even decisions feel delayed. Even motivation feels like something you have to chase instead of something that naturally exists inside you. But this is not weakness. It is signal. A signal that your internal world is saturated, overfilled, overstimulated. And anything overfilled eventually stops flowing properly. And when flow stops, life starts to feel like friction. The strange part is you don't need a new identity to fix this. You don't need a perfect plan. You don't need more information. You need space. Mental space. Emotional space. The kind of space that allows your thoughts to settle instead of constantly collide. Because clarity does not come from adding more. It comes from removing what no longer belongs. And the moment you start recognizing that truth, something subtle begins to shift. Not externally, internally. You start noticing what drains you instead of just what demands you. You start feeling where your energy disappears. You start realizing that not everything you carry is actually yours to carry. That realization alone changes the direction of everything. That realization alone changes the direction of everything. Because once you see what has been draining you, you can no longer unsee it. And that is where the real discomfort begins. Not in the awareness itself, but in what awareness demands from you. It demands change. It demands honesty. It demands that you stop negotiating with the very patterns that are keeping you stuck. And this is where most people hesitate. Because it is easier to understand your problems than to confront them. Understanding feels safe. It feels like progress without risk. But confrontation is different. It forces you to interrupt your own patterns in real time. It forces you to stop feeding what is already hurting you. And the mind resists this immediately. It will offer excuses. It will create urgency around things that don't matter. It will convince you that now is not the right time. Because deep down, your old system is trying to protect itself. Even if that system is the reason you feel exhausted, scattered, and disconnected. But you cannot heal inside the same structure that is producing the damage. And the moment you accept that truth, something shifts. Not in your external world, but in your internal tolerance. You begin to notice what you can no longer ignore. Conversations that drain you start feeling louder. Habits that once felt normal now feel heavy. Even the way you spend your attention starts to feel expensive. Because suddenly, you realize your energy is not unlimited. It is being spent constantly, without awareness, without control. And that is the breaking point most people never reach consciously. They just slowly fade into exhaustion. But you are seeing it now. And seeing it clearly changes everything, because clarity creates pressure. And pressure demands movement. This is where the idea of stopping becomes unavoidable. Not stopping your life, but stopping the leak. Stopping the unconscious patterns that keep pulling you away from yourself. The endless input, the constant reaction, the automatic yes to everything that fragments your focus. And when you begin to stop even slightly, the discomfort rises. Because silence reveals what noise was hiding. Thoughts become louder. Emotions become more visible. You may even feel like things are getting worse, but they are not. They are surfacing. And anything that surfaces can be understood. Anything that can be understood can be changed. But you have to stay long enough in that discomfort to see through it. Because this is the part where transformation actually begins. Not when everything feels good, but when you finally stop escaping what feels unclear inside you. And as the noise reduces, something unexpected happens. Your mind starts to reorganize itself. Thoughts that were scattered begin to connect. Priorities that were blurred start to sharpen. You begin to feel moments of stillness that don't feel empty anymore. They feel clean. And in those moments, you realize something powerful. You were not lost. You were overloaded. And overload makes even simple direction feel impossible. But once the overload begins to reduce, direction doesn't need to be created. It begins to reveal itself naturally. This is why the real shift is not about doing more. It is about removing what keeps breaking your attention. Because attention is the foundation of your entire life experience. Whatever holds your attention shapes your reality. And when your attention is scattered, your life becomes scattered with it. But when your attention returns to you, even partially, everything starts to realign. You start choosing differently without forcing it. You start walking away from things that no longer match your energy. You stop needing constant stimulation just to feel okay. And for the first time in a long time, your mind begins to feel like it belongs to you again. And that is where urgency becomes real. Because once you experience even a glimpse of that clarity, going back to chaos is no longer ignorance. It becomes a choice. And you realize that every day you delay this reset, you are reinforcing the very patterns you are trying to escape. There is no dramatic moment where everything changes at once. There is only the quiet decision to stop abandoning yourself in small ways. And that decision, repeated consistently, becomes the restart. And that is where the restart begins to take shape, not as an idea in your mind, but as a quiet shift in how you respond to your own life. Because once you see the pattern, you can no longer fully participate in it the same way. Something inside you starts to resist what used to feel normal, not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently. A subtle refusal to keep betraying your own attention. And this is where everything becomes more serious than it ever felt before. Because now you are not just tired, you are aware of why you are tired. You are not just distracted, you are aware of what is stealing your focus. And awareness removes the comfort of ignorance. You cannot pretend anymore that nothing is wrong. But awareness alone is not freedom. It is pressure. It is the moment before action. And most people get stuck here, carrying the weight of understanding without converting it into change. They think insight is enough. But insight without execution becomes mental suffering. It turns into self-awareness that hurts instead of heals. So now the real question is no longer what is wrong with your life. The question becomes, what are you still willing to tolerate? Because your life is not shaped only by what you want. It is shaped by what you continue accepting. Every delay, every distraction, every unnecessary yes is silently building the same reality you complain about. And that is the uncomfortable truth most people avoid. Nothing outside is holding you in place. It is the accumulation of small internal permissions you keep giving to things that do not deserve your energy. And those permissions are costing you more than you realize. They are costing your clarity, your focus, your sense of direction. But here is where the shift deepens. Because once you begin to notice this, your tolerance changes. You stop reacting to everything. You stop feeding every thought with attention. You start realizing that not every feeling needs action. Not every urge deserves follow-through. Not every distraction deserves a response. And in that space, something new starts forming. Discipline. Not the forced kind, not the rigid kind, but the kind that comes from self-respect. The kind that says your attention is no longer available for everything that pulls it. And at first, it feels uncomfortable. Because your mind has been trained to scatter. It has been trained to switch, to scroll, to react, to escape stillness. So when you begin to remove that constant stimulation, the mind resists. It creates noise. It creates urgency. It tries to pull you back into old patterns because those patterns feel familiar. But familiarity is not safety. Familiarity is just repetition. And repetition is what builds the life you are trying to escape from. So now every moment becomes a decision point. Do you go back into distraction, or do you stay present long enough to rebuild yourself? And these decisions do not look big on the surface. They are small, almost invisible, but they are stacking. And what they are stacking is identity. Because identity is not created in one breakthrough moment. It is built in repeated choices. Every time you choose focus over noise, you are rewriting who you are. Every time you choose awareness over escape, you are strengthening a new internal structure. And slowly, without you even realizing it, the chaos begins to lose authority over you. It is still there, but it no longer defines you. It no longer controls the direction of your thoughts. You begin to observe it instead of obey it. And that shift alone changes everything. Because the moment you stop obeying your distractions, you start remembering your power. Not as something emotional, but as something practical. The ability to choose where your mind goes. The ability to decide what gets access to you. And that is the real restart. Not a new life appearing suddenly, but the return of control over your attention. Because once attention is reclaimed, direction naturally follows. And once direction returns, motivation stops being something you chase. It becomes something that follows you. And when motivation stops being something you chase, you start to notice something even more powerful. You are no longer reacting to your life. You are shaping it in real time. Because attention, once reclaimed, does not stay neutral. It starts building direction. It starts creating structure where there was once chaos. And that is where refocus begins to take root, not as effort, but as alignment. But alignment is not gentle at first. It exposes everything you ignored while you were distracted. It shows you how much time was lost in loops that felt productive but were actually draining your direction. And that realization can feel heavy. Not because you failed, but because you finally see the cost of not being present. And most people try to escape this moment too. They try to comfort themselves quickly. They look for shortcuts back into comfort. But comfort is exactly what created the drift in the first place. So going back does not heal anything. It only delays the confrontation with reality. And reality, when seen clearly, becomes a mirror you can no longer avoid. It shows you exactly where your energy goes when you are not conscious. It shows you how often you choose distraction over direction. And it shows you how much of your life has been shaped without intention. But this is not punishment. This is clarity. And clarity is the beginning of control. Because once you see where you are leaking energy, you can finally start sealing those leaks, one by one, without overwhelm, without needing perfection, just awareness followed by adjustment. And as you begin to adjust, something subtle but powerful happens. Your days start to feel different. Not easier, not instantly better, but more intentional, less scattered, more contained. And that containment is what restores strength. Because energy that is constantly divided cannot build momentum. But energy that is contained begins to compound. And now you start to experience something unfamiliar. You finish things. You pause before reacting. You choose instead of drift. And each small choice reinforces a new internal identity. Not the identity of someone trying to fix their life, but someone who is actively directing it. And this is where the stakes rise internally, because you begin to understand something irreversible. Every time you return to focus, you become harder to distract. Every time you protect your attention, your clarity strengthens. And every time you ignore the noise loses influence over you. But the opposite is also true. Every return to old habits weakens that clarity. Every unnecessary distraction rebuilds the fog. And now you see both paths clearly. One leads to fragmentation, the other leads to structure. And there is no neutral ground anymore once you become aware of this. This is why refocus is not a moment. It is a direction you protect. A direction that must be chosen repeatedly, even when your mind tries to pull you back into old familiarity. Because the old version of you was not built in one day. It was built through repetition. And the new version will be built the same way. But now the difference is awareness. You are no longer building unconsciously. You are building with intention. And intention changes everything. Because it turns ordinary actions into identity formation. It turns discipline into self-respect. And it turns focus into power. And slowly, something shifts inside you that cannot be easily reversed. You stop waiting to feel ready. You stop waiting for perfect conditions. You start moving with clarity, even when motivation is low. Because you understand that clarity does not come after action. It comes through action. And this is the point where your life stops being something you analyze and starts becoming something you direct. Not perfectly, not without resistance, but consciously. And that consciousness is the beginning of a completely different existence. Because when you reset your mind, restart your habits, and refocus your attention, you are not just improving your routine. You are reclaiming the version of yourself that was always there underneath the noise, waiting for you to finally choose it again. And the moment you realize that, something inside you stops negotiating with your old life. Because you can no longer pretend you don't know what's happening. You can no longer tell yourself that confusion is the problem. Confusion was never the problem. Avoidance was, delay was, distraction was. And now those patterns feel different. Not harmless, not neutral. They feel expensive. Because every time you drift back into them, you are not just losing time anymore, you are losing direction. And direction is harder to rebuild than time. This is where the pressure becomes real. Not external pressure, but internal accountability. The kind that doesn't need anyone watching. The kind that quietly asks you what you did with your attention today. And the answer is no longer invisible to you. You feel it. You know it instantly. And this awareness creates tension. Because part of you wants to rise, but another part still wants comfort. Part of you wants structure, but another part still wants escape. And you start to feel the split happening inside you. One path pulling you forward, one path pulling you back. But here is the truth that changes everything. You cannot walk both paths. You cannot build focus while feeding distraction. You cannot create clarity while protecting chaos. At some point, you have to stop splitting your energy between who you are and who you keep returning to. And that decision does not arrive loudly. It arrives in moments, in small choices that seem insignificant, but are actually defining your direction. Whether you open what you said you wouldn't open, whether you return to what you said you were done with, whether you protect your attention or surrender it again. And every choice is writing something deeper than habit. It is writing identity. Because identity is not declared, it is repeated. And what you repeat becomes stronger than what you intend. So now the real battle is not motivation. It is repetition. It is what you return to when no one is watching. It is what you choose when there is no urgency forcing you. It is what you do in the quiet moments that seem small, but are actually shaping everything. And slowly, if you stay aware long enough, you start noticing a shift. The pull of old patterns weakens, not because they disappear, but because your awareness stops feeding them automatically. You pause more. You question more. You interrupt the cycle before it fully takes over. And that interruption is where power begins to rebuild. Because every time you interrupt a pattern, you create space. And in that space, something new has a chance to exist. A different response, a different choice, a different version of you that was always possible but never consistently activated. And that is when refocus stops being an idea and becomes a lived experience. You start noticing time differently. You start feeling your attention return in pieces. You start realizing that your mind is not your enemy. It is just trained. And anything trained can be retrained. But retraining requires patience with discomfort, because your mind will resist the change at first. It will try to pull you back into the familiar loops that once felt normal. Not because they are right, but because they are known, and the brain always confuses familiarity with safety. But you are no longer operating from that confusion. You are beginning to see it clearly, and clarity is what breaks the illusion. Once you see the pattern, it loses its authority over you. It may still appear, but it no longer defines your direction unless you allow it to. And this is where everything tightens. Because now you are no longer reacting blindly, you are choosing consciously. Even in small moments, especially in small moments. And those moments begin to stack, quietly, consistently, powerfully. And without noticing it at first, your life starts to reorganize itself around your attention. Not your stress, not your distraction, not your fear, your attention. Because whatever holds your attention long enough begins to shape your reality around it. So when you finally start protecting it, even imperfectly, everything begins to shift. And what once felt like chaos starts to feel like something you are no longer participating in the same way. And that distance is where your transformation begins to solidify into something real.